Oh my, what a wonderful crowd and what a wonderful day, huh? I'm going to get home. I was prepared for some overcast skies today. As early as this morning, that's what weather was forecasting for us, and I thought, well, fine. I didn't bring sunscreen with me, and I'm going to go home beet red. And my wife is going to do one of these, and I told you. I'll live. I have been here a couple of other times. My message will vary slightly. It's been a pleasure. That's partly a reflection of just a deep involvement and a deep love of this place. You have it, you're here, you care for it, and that speaks volumes. And I'll express some thought on why as we get along. The setting here is really all about gold, isn't it? Gold is discovered by Custer in 1874. He came out of a completely different arena. He exited to the north and west, or north and east to Bismarck, to Fort Abraham Lincoln. Before him, there are no wagon trails through here. There's Indian traffic galore. There's a Fort Laramie to the agency's trail, but that passes way south of here. There simply is no traces of white humankind here before gold. In 1875, that changes. It was the government's simple want when gold was announced, when gold was discovered, and that triggered a rush and an economic time of peril in the country. And this was Indian country. Gold that was locked up in the middle of the Great Sioux Reservation, and whites were simply not welcome. Prospectors were simply not welcome there. And yet gold is announced. It was the government's style to meet with Indian people, to do their best to negotiate an understanding or a claim. They set out to buy the Black Hills. Custer didn't determine a value, he just determined a presence. And so in 1875, that's when the first wagons passed this country. On a second expedition, the Richard Irving Dodge expedition, the Newton-Jenny expedition, that starts at Fort Laramie and wends its way northward now through these breaks and more or less to Newcastle, and turns east in Newcastle and makes its way onto ultimately the French Creek diggings where Custer's gold had been discovered. Wagons. If you're here in 1875, you would variously note these several different kind of roads that do evolve here. This doesn't, there's no presence like this here. There's just a trail. But if you were here and you're looking south, of course you're looking upon the Fort Laramie Road, aren't you? And if you're looking straight north, which is the way those wagons went, you're looking on the Black Hills Road. That becomes soon enough the Deadwood Road. Dodge, when he leaves the Black Hills, confirming now, coming to an estimate of a mineral value of those hills, he travels that same route as he's going back to Fort Laramie. So now we're scoring this ground again with wagons. We're now blazing a trail through here. But he leaves soldiers behind. This is still an Indian ground. That attempt to purchase the hills hadn't occurred yet. Troops are left there, and troops are scouring this broad landscape for whites and finding them and escorting them out of the hills. And Dodge leaves 3 companies of soldiers on French Creek with the express purpose of, you're in the middle of gold country and you find miners, you get them the hell out of there. And their way out of there to Fort Laramie was down the same route that Custer used in 1874 when he is sending his courier to Fort Laramie, the nearest telegraph, to announce this gold. And that is through the Pleasant Valley and down Red Canyon and ultimately really through this country. And that becomes the Custer City Road, doesn't it? At first it's known as the Pollock Cutoff. That's the guy that commanded the troops up there. So these roads are known by their destination. It's as simple as that. You know, if you're looking south from here, you're looking upon the Fort Laramie, or you're looking upon the Cheyenne Road. If you're at Fort Laramie and you're looking north, you're looking upon the Black Hills Road, or you're looking eventually, not much later, upon the Hat Creek Road from Fort Laramie. If you're here, you're looking on the, you get it. These roads, by whichever way you entered the hills, this is just simply dangerous country in 1875 and 1876, particularly in 1876. The attempt to purchase the Black Hills at Camp Robinson, at Red Cloud Agency, it just blew up in commissioners' faces. Indian people over there were simply not ready to sever their interests in the Black Hills. That was sacred ground to them. It was, Sitting Bull called it the Great Food Pack. And commissioners gave up and disappeared. The president simply withdrew those soldiers and just let the rush ensue. And to get there from the south, by whichever way you went, you crossed Indian country. And it was chaotic. You put traffic on this road, and pretty soon, you know, in the fall, inside it says in early 1876. I know it also as late in 1875. The first of the stations is built here speculatively by one of the traders over at Red Cloud Agency, J.W. Deere, already with the enticement of a stage company prepared to deliver people to the Black Hills. But over that winter, that station is burned, disappears very quickly. There just is chaos rendered across the landscape. In the spring of 1876, in the wake of the first great battle of what is this Indian War, the fight on the Powder River in March, Sitting Bull, very quickly thereafter, in the north, he's a traditionalist. He has nothing to do with the agencies. That is his land, but these are his people, and he calls the traditional people to join him. And if you're at an agency, you were commonly either an agency Indian, you were someone that either you're married into a trader, you understood the nature of what was going on, or you were a traditional person that preferred hunting buffalo, but would drop in at an agency from time to time because it was convenient and important. It was a way to get trade goods, it was a way to trade with family, it was a way to augment what your daily needs were. Well, he's calling those people to join him in this great fight for the buffalo country. And there's a passage of Indians, there's troops out here now, not the troops that come here, but there's cavalry now that are doing their best to kind of just patrol this mayhem, this land of mayhem. And at the same time, there is in this call of these traditional people to join Sitting Bull, there's a confrontation not very far north of here in the late winter, early spring 76. And 600 Indians are fleeing the agencies over here. And one company of soldiers, Egan's company from Fort Laramie, he encounters, that's a lot of Indians, and he's 50 men. Some shots are exchanged. Those soldiers just got out of the way. Those Indians made it to the growing Indian camp in time for the Battle of the Rosebud and in time for the Battle of the Little Bighorn. This increase of trouble so annoyed the government that the government proposed something more. In 1870, early 1876, remember Metz is killed, Metz and his wife. He's a baker from from Laramie, and he's in Custer City that previous winter and wants out. And he comes south with his cook. So three people are killed, some others are wounded in Red Canyon. It's the Red Canyon Massacre. It was actually the handiwork of an outlaw and a gang of Indian cutthroats, but an outlaw, Persimmon Bill Chambers. These guys all have these wonderful names. That man, Chambers, we've reestablished, we've rebuilt the station here. There's a superintendent of the line named H.E. Brown, Henry Brown, Stuttering Brown. He manages the line from Hat Creek to Custer City. His interest is just the passage of coaches and the safeguarding of his stock and whatnot, and he sees Persimmon Bill Chambers at the Cheyenne River Station out here, and he challenges to his face, "You leave my stock alone. You stay out of our way." And he continues on, Brown, to come back to here. Chambers shoots him in the back at the Indian Creek Station out here. Brown is delivered in his pathetic, desperately wounded condition to this place. A surgeon is summoned from Fort Laramie, and he expires. They take him to Fort Laramie, they take him on, and the company takes him down to Cheyenne. Brown's family had relocated to Salt Lake City, where the station company operated, or from where they operated. And his wife and a couple of children were brought to Cheyenne to escort the man's body to the home burial plot in Omaha, and where he resides today. And interestingly, I'm a member of the Omaha Corral of the Westerners. And I was exploring this story some while ago, and in such and such a cemetery, you can find it. You trace the story in the newspapers, and you can find the Methodist minister, his name, who performed rites at the station and took him out to Prospect Hill Cemetery, one of the grand old cemeteries of town. And so I went out there. It's an old cemetery. Their records are not what you see on Find a Grave today. And but they knew, oh yeah, he's in such and such a plot. He's in the Brown family plot. It's over there. And I went out there, and you can find the Brown family plot. It's the size of the floor, the footing of this place, this tent, this cover, unmarked. Well, our man Brown is in the middle of that someplace. And so to our Westerners Corral, I said, we need to put a stone on that grave, and in 2019, by golly, we did. So you can see it on Find a Grave today. You can go out there today and you can find that place. Well, mayhem, that's the point, mayhem on the trail. And there's more. Well, this brings the Army here in a different capacity, not just a patrol here from time to time, but it brings troops here in June 1876. Companies of infantry detailed out of Crook's department, one detailed to this place to establish a station adjacent to the stage station, and another to establish a station at the mouth of Red Canyon. This one known as Camp on Sage Creek at first, and that known as Camp mouth of Red Canyon gets short and sweetened and becomes Camp Hat Creek over the course of time. They establish a permanence here that lasts for 2 years. I was, before coming here this morning, I had in my mind's eye that you could see evidence of that right over here beneath the cedar tree, right up against the corner of the building. Well, as to my surprise this morning, there is no cedar tree on the immediate right side of the building, east side of the building, and it's not the cedar tree beyond. And so perhaps I'm told that it is probably underneath the post office, the corner of that redoubt that is that portion of the Army camp here, Camp on Sage Creek. Theirs was not like this. Theirs was as unpretentious as can be, except for rock redoubts in corners If troops were attacked, they had a place to go. And you get this clear sense of that. There's photographs of that inside. And it's here. And you go around toward the bathrooms in the back, and there is stone rubble around there, and it just could be rubble from that. I think that's important. We don't know where the other redoubt is. And otherwise, those boys for 2 years are under canvas and nothing more. That's the infantry that comes here just to establish a presence here in the midst of all of this going on. But there's also a cavalry regiment detailed to this landscape, especially in the wake of the mayhem out here, the Brown and the Metz killings. And that's the 5th Cavalry. And they have their own legendary encounter in due course. They arrive and they are on, their job is to block the Indian trail to Sitting Bull's camp. That's their general mission. And they did it by just constantly pounding the trail back and forth as far north as the Cheyenne River. And they get word in early July of yet another band of traditional people, Northern Cheyennes now at the Red Cloud Agency, that are preparing to join Sitting Bull in the North Country. You know, the going north is good this year. We killed Custer. We beat Crook at the Rosebud. Join us. This war isn't ending anytime soon. And that word got to some Cheyennes that were at Camp Robinson, Red Cloud Agency. That was their agency headquarters. And they were moved by that and determined to go. Well, they were also very closely watched by the military over there. And when they picked up and were alighting, that word was passed by couriers as fast as possible to Fort Laramie and passed as fast as possible to those troops in the field who skedaddled their way to passing this place, picking up this infantry company to join them as guard for their wagons as they continue east, and reach Warbonnet Creek on the evening of the 16th of July. And that next morning, that column of cavalry confronts those oncoming Cheyennes. And it becomes the skirmish at Warbonnet Creek. Notable, Buffalo Bill Cody is scouting for the 5th Cavalry, and notable because he is cued from the cut banks of the creek to charge the scouts of that village of Cheyennes coming this way. And he launches, those scouts see, and they charge as well, and from a distance shoot at each other, and the Indians' shot misses, but Cody's shot drops the horse, that man's horse. He goes over and kills him, and he scalps him. And he raises that scalp as troopers are riding by, chasing those Indians back to the agent, and proclaiming the first scalp for Custer. And indeed it was. That's a great title for a book, isn't it? It's written. Anyway, they're just color here at left and right. In 1876, and my other occasions here, I've shared some of these names with you. There just is incidentally also this extraordinary parade of characters passing through here, and ultimately national characters. Jack Langrish, if you are an aficionado of the American stage, in the 1870s, you may have seen him someplace, whether in New York or Chicago or more recently in the mining camps of Colorado. Deadwood is founded by now and is a growing community of miners, a prosperous operation, and Langrish and his troupe of actors decides to go there and pass the Hat Creek Station. Banjo Dick Brown shortly after. You get into Black Hills Gold Rush history, new book out on that. I commend to you by Peter Cousins, Deadwood. It's the factual version of the Deadwood TV show. You'll love the book. Banjo Dick Brown is there. You know, he's an entertainer also. He plays a musical instrument and sings songs from stages, you know, in the bars at Deadwood. The ballad he writes, "The Dreary Black Hills," find it and read it. It speaks to, well, there is that glory. It is really just despicable hard work. Hickok, the most notorious of all, Hickok passes this country, and his small band of characters, to include Calamity Jane in that bunch. He en route to Deadwood, drawn also by gold, and to his own infamous end. Cody passes through here several times. Cody, you know, if as much as we care about the American West, we should thank ultimately Buffalo Bill. We owe it all to Buffalo Bill. Buffalo Bill was a stage man before and he had incidentally scouted earlier. That's how the Army knew him as a scout and engaged him again as a scout during this summer campaign. But he was on theater stages before that, what he called the combination show. It's just more or less him and a couple of actors doing small bits. He went back to the combination performances after this summer campaign, but imagine something more. Imagines an arena show. You know, it's a version in 1883 of a rodeo, but to include a genuine Cheyenne Black Hills stagecoach. That coach is alive and well. You see that one up in Cody, Wyoming today. They reenact the skirmish at Warbonnet Creek. Not just to national audiences, but he takes it abroad. And he does more to popularize the history of the American West than any other man in America. We love this guy. Captain Jack Crawford is through here. I wrote a different book featuring the letters of Captain Jack Crawford. He's a reporter in 1876 for the Omaha Bee newspaper. He's a stringer. And he goes to the gold country to report the doings in the gold country. The letters are just rich and wonderful. He passes through here a time or two, adopts the title Captain Jack, the Poet Scout of the Black Hills. He joins Cody in the fall of 1876, 1877. Well, Cody is still doing his combination shows, and he's the Indian guy getting killed in the reenactment when they do the first Scout for Custer thing. Charlie King is here in 1876. I've had a fascination with this guy for a long time. He was an officer in the 5th Cavalry with this movement. He is the character we know. Why we know is what we know about the skirmish at Warbonnet Creek is because it comes out of King's books. He had been wounded. He's a young officer with the 5th. He had been wounded in an Apache fight a couple of years earlier. That wound never exactly healed. It ultimately, a couple of years later, leads to his retirement. And to make a living in retirement, he becomes a novelist. But he writes Army stories. Now, he's not read today. Nobody knows about this guy today. But I'll tell you, you want interesting reading, find any of his books. We reprinted one down at Fort Laramie, Laramie, or The Queen of Bedlam. It's just wonderful stuff. And he was a bestseller in his day. And he's a Hat Creek character. And then there's one other saga that caught my attention when I was doing this most recent book. I have these inside. You all take one of these. You go in and find one of these and take one of these with you. This announces this book coming out. Sitting Bull's War. There's a chapter in that book devoted to the coming in of Crazy Horse. And you know the story generally, but there's a twist to it that I want to share with you. The war did not go well, you know that. There's just no way you can withstand the continual pressure of Army troops from every quarter of that landscape, the Buffalo Prairie landscape. And their hunting cycles were disrupted. They couldn't put away winter larder. Those people ultimately were starving. And the government offered the option of come to an agency, give us your weapons and your ponies, and we'll feed you. And people were offended, or people by need were moved. And Crazy Horse resisted for the longest while until even his followers had had enough. And they came in the spring of 1877. The way the story is commonly told, it picks up on the 5th of May, 1877, on the shoulders of Camp Robinson, Fort Robinson. You go to the fort today and you look west and you see the highest horizon, and that's where this occurred, where he's leading 800 people, Oglala people for the most part, to Red Cloud Agency to surrender. And he's met on that ridgetop by an officer. You know, they have a council. That officer details what's going to happen to you. This is what we expect. This is what you're going to have to do, those weapons and all that. You're going to be counted, and then you're going to be fed. Well, that story actually begins, that surrender episode, that saga actually begins a couple of days earlier, almost right here. Word that he was coming in, and it was a difficult travel because they were barely able to feed themselves day to day. And word passed to the commanding officer at Camp Robinson that these people need food badly. And that commanding officer dispatched wagons of foodstuffs and a herd of cattle. And they met them on, that officer and that caravan and those cows met those people on Sage Creek, just north of here. And where that officer shook Crazy Horse's hand, the first time in Crazy Horse's life that he had shaken the hand of a white man. And they made clear what's happening, but first eat. And they did exactly that. And they were there for 3 days, feasting, they called it, feasting, before coming in to that episode that you know. I dare say, of course, this building didn't exist then. If we were standing on its roof, looking north, looking down Sage Creek, we'd watch it. That's how close this was to us. There's a charming structural succession here I want to touch on. I learned a little bit more from the Wades this morning about this. That first station, whether built in the late fall of 75 and burned that winter by Indians, or whether built in the earliest of winter and burned by Indians, was succeeded by one we know much more about, that adjoined more or less this building just to the west of us toward the creek. An L-shaped thing, rather sizable. It was this was one of the more important of the way stations on the way north. But if to see photographs of these way stations, from Cheyenne to here, there's a real similarity. You know, they are squat log buildings that are this tall and sod roofed and pretty unpretentious, but for size, and this one was a big one, and it adjoined here. And we have marvelous photographs of it, and in several of those photographs you see that one of these Army redoubts that I mentioned. That in turn was succeeded by this in the early 1880s, and lasted as long as a stage operation, as long as the stage operated. The death of stage companies like this was railroading, and railroaders had passed into this country, or came to this country in the late 1880s. What becomes the cowboy line across northern Nebraska, but goes north, I believe, in and around where Hedren is today, and connects to the Black Hills. And that was the death of the Sydney Road. That was the death of this. So local service continued for a while, but not this. Get off the train in Cheyenne, catch a coach, and we'll deliver you to Deadwood. That ended. You knew if you were bound for the hills to take the train. And service continued here for a little while longer. Others are going to tell us more about what happened here over the course of time, that ultimately the sum of which I think protects this place, leads to the very existence of this place, and I will allow them to tell their stories, but only to acknowledge that this is still here, and for lots of reasons it's still here. And I want to end my few comments with simply the highest tip of a hat to you. Yesterday, every time I come into this country, I have two missions, and I get here regularly enough, even from Omaha. I have to see that stagecoach, and I did again yesterday morning. The coach you have in town, that mud wagon, I would dare say is the rarer of Cheyenne coaches. The kind that Cody ran on his show, you know, the hard-topped, hard-sided, they were here too. They seem to survive in a different way. Mud wagons, these canvas-sided utilitarian wagons, of which you have one in immaculate condition, is, I would say, the rarer of the type. And you've got one, and you jealously care for it, and I tip my hat to you for that. And I tip my hat to you for this. You care for this place. You are all here because you care for this place. The Wades live over there and keep their eye on this place, but they're not the only ones. You all are here, and I just only so deeply appreciate that. Between that mud wagon and this place, you are truly protecting some of the finest of American heritage, and I applaud you and thank you for that. And I thank you for being here and listening to my prattle this afternoon. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Paul. You've given us all something new to think about and some other avenues to explore. So maybe in another, what's it been, 35 years since you were here? We'll be back and talk about it some more. So next we're going to have Ben Hanson. Ben is going to come and do a talk, and he's going to try to show some pictures on, this is like attempt number 3 of the day, to adapt to technology. You are welcome to move your chairs closer. Everything is going to be filmed and will be available on Niobrara County Library's YouTube website. So if you don't get to see a picture today, you will get a chance to see it later, and Ben still has lots of information to give us.
Thank you. That's hard to follow right there. That's an educated dude. So, I am a 5th generation rancher here, and I just got to looking out there, and there's several others with the Goddards and the Mings and the Mills family and the Cruzies, and if I forgot you, yell at me later. Sorry about that. So, JoAnn asked me to talk about the OW Ranch history, and it's always been kind of fascinating just how this country has slowly developed and the change that has came through. And I think about how it started with the Cheyenne to Deadwood Stage Trail, and then shortly after that, as I think my great-grandfather talked about, the range generals moved into this country, and we talk about the open range cattle outfits. And you can't really talk about the open range cattle outfits without thinking of the OW Ranch and the Converse Cattle Company. They were some of the first in this area. Hard to see, but this is the OW Ranch headquarters. They took this picture early 1800s, and it was a pretty primitive row of bunkhouses, so to say. And we'll just dive into how it became the OW. So Oliver O.C. Wade is where the OW branch originated. And I was always under the assumption that the OW stood for the Old Woman Creek, but once again, and many times I was wrong. But so it was told is that the rival of O.C. Wade is he came here in the late 1870s, which, as we learned, Custer's Massacre was 1876. So in that timeline, there really wasn't much for, I mean, the Indian hostility was still going on, but there was still people around here starting to get hooked on this freight trail and trying to make a living. And O.C. Wade came here during a blizzard with about 100 head of cows and bulls. And I think the blizzard was so rough, he untied the bulls and kicked the cows loose. And he found some shelter on a meadow, which would become the present day OW, where it still stands today. And he built a dugout and a center post with a beam and covered it with pine boughs and dirt. And he lived in this crude shelter through the winter. And that was the beginning of the OW. And another local lore is that the Old Woman Creek, that why they call it Old Woman Creek is they heard an old Indian lady wailing and crying on a high creek bank. So comes in Addison Spa, Manville and Peck. So Addison Spa, he was a young cowboy around 23 years old, and he was working for the Swan Brothers near Cheyenne. And he was an orphan child that came up the Texas Trail, and he came up here about the same, I don't know if it was the same trail, but he came here at the same time that Captain James Cook, who founded the Agate Fossils Bed. They were on the same trail up into this country. So Swan's foreman asked who they thought would be a worthy foreman of a new ranch for Manville and Peck, and they suggested Addison Spa. So the Manville and Peck, which I believe is Hiram Manville and James Peck, they were wealthy businessmen from Milwaukee, and they wanted to get into the cattle venture. So they met with Spa, excuse me, and they were talking that they said, we like it right here where Swan's at when we'd like to start a ranch here. And Addison Spa said, this country, if you want a summer vacation spot, this place is just fine, but I think we need to go north. And so they bought a buckboard at Fort Laramie, and they came out in this country and started exploring. And so they looked around Fort Laramie, and then they went to Fort Robinson, where there's the Fort Robinson Trail to Fort Fetterman. And they stopped in here, and they met with the locals here, and they said, you know, O.C. Wade, the man that's the freighter, he's looking to get out of the business. And I bet you could buy his outfit. So they met with him, and by that time, he had worked his way up to 1,200 head of cattle. And they dickered back and forth, and what they came to terms on was Spa urged Manville and Peck to buy him out for $36,900. And they acquired 1,200 head of stock, 30 horses, all the buildings and equipment, and the ranch rights. And there's a picture of Spa horseback. So once Manville and Peck secured the OW, they had already purchased 2,000 head of steers in Oregon, and they had them contracted to be trailed to the Laramie Plains. So that was in the late 1870s, I think 1879 or 1880. And this kind of kicked off the cattle boom that was awaiting, that without the Indian hostility, there was a big boom on the horizon. And they had all this wonderful feed, forage, and water that was untouched. And so by the time Spa was able to get the cattle trailed from the plains to the OW, they already had 3,200 head of cattle, and they were in the business. So that fall, Spa, once they were done doing the fall work, he told his cowboys, he said, either you guys can go on, because that was customary. Once they were done in the fall, them cowboys had the winter to be laid up and doing nothing. So he said, if you guys, I'll keep you on, but you have to help me build up these headquarters. So some stayed, and then SPA hired 2 woodsmen with broad axes. So the cowboys would go out in the country and cut the pine and the spruce and bring them in on the running gears on the wagon. And then those woodsmen with the broad axes would hand hew those logs, and they started building the bunkhouses. And there's 2 of those buildings that still stand today with the hand hewed logs. And I believe that construction was somewhere in the 1881 or 1882. And there's a few pictures here of what we were able to get of the OW Ranch. So in 1880, SPA was summoned to Cheyenne, and turned out that Manville and Peck, they had figured they got a good line on this country, and they knew it would work. But they needed more capital. So they went to Cheyenne and met with Asa Converse, who was the president of the First National Bank of Cheyenne. And with meeting with him, they agreed that they were going to start buying up more outfits in this country to put together a larger holding. So they combined with W.R. Irvine, which Irvine's a pretty prevalent name around Converse County. They built empire there as well. So they needed they needed a man to start putting that country together. And Irvine was pushing for his guy to ramrod the whole deal. And Manville and Peck wanted SPA in there. So SPA came out. Once they told him what they were thinking, SPA came out. He put together some rough wagons. He had, because it was a lot of people were ego-driven, and they had to have a set of Missouri mules pulling their cook wagons. And they had to have the nicest wagon. Well, SPA just got a bunch of rough 2x8s and built a wagon, and he went through all the Remuda and just picked out the biggest saddle horses. And for a quarter of the cost, he had the wagons rigged up, ready to go. And that was enough to put him in charge of being the range manager of the Converse Cattle Company. So when they broke it down to the officers, Asa Converse was the president, W.R. Irvine was the vice president, Peck was the secretary and treasurer, Manville was the general manager, and SPA was the range manager. So this became Converse Cattle Company, which was a huge undertaking. And Converse Cattle Company, not in a hole, but where their range would drift, their livestock would drift, there was no fences. So they claimed that Converse Cattle Company ran from the Nebraska border all the way to Independence Rock, which is 20,000 square miles. So this was recognized, at the time, it was recognized as $500,000 capital in this entity. Later, it would become worth $1 million, and that was the first $1 million cattle company that this area had known. So SPA was putting this all together, and a little side note, bear with me. When SPA, Manville, and Peck were coming from Fort Laramie over to Fort Robinson, SPA ran into an old, can you hear me back there? I drift and get to BSing, so bear with me. So SPA, Manville, and Peck were going from Fort Laramie to Fort Robinson. Well, they ran across an old friend of SPA's, and this guy was half lit. His name was George Ray. And anyways, George Ray told SPA, he said, hey man, you owe me one. I got you hired on at Bill Bland's place. I would appreciate it if you would return the favor. And he was uneasy about the guy, but true to his word, when he became the range manager of Converse Cattle Company, he needed a wagon boss, or several wagon bosses, so he hired him on. And he had a bad feeling about it, and he hired him with mixed emotions. Well, they had been having problems with him because he was running a wagon at Rawhide Creek, and that sneaky little snake would go down to the Fort Laramie and get all liquored up and be a buffoon, and he'd go to causing problems. And one day, he came to Hack Creek Stage Station right here. He got loaded up on cheap whiskey and rode over to the OW headquarters there, where SPA was branding calves, and he was actually a horseback. According to the story, he was dragging calves in. And he sat up on the top rail, watched him for a few minutes, and one of the hired hands, his name was Clarence Hand, and he was a quiet young man, and he noticed that something was off with George Ray, and he saw George Ray grabbing for his pistol. So he pulled up right next to it. He said, "Drop it or I'll plug you." So George backed down, he holstered his gun, and he rode away. The Spa later thanked Clarence, and he said he would likely have been killed that day if it was not for him. And it probably would, if Spa gets shot that day, that changes the course of a lot of Niobrara County history, because that man was very active, for better or worse. There's lots of stories about him, as there's lots of stories about me too. Most of them are probably true. But anyways, so another skirmish that Spa got himself into, in the fall of '83, they were completely kicking butt and getting through things, and they had gathered 6,000 head of steers that were ready for slaughter. And it's a lot different than nowadays. You know, we'll just get calves or yearlings and we'll put them on a truck and send them on the way. Well, it was a little bit different 140 years ago. They waited till these steers were mature and fat till they were 2s or 3s. I could be wrong about that, but probably 3s. So he wanted to take them to Valentine for delivery, and that's where a railroad came in. And Valentine is about 300 miles from here. And they got them trailed into Valentine, and as it goes, a bunch of young cowboys that have been working too hard, they got to blow off some steam, right? So they go into town, and one of the cowboys, probably full of liquor, was, they called it harmless fun then, but I call it probably scary. But he shot out a candle with his pistol right there in the bar, and it pissed the sheriff off. So the sheriff just dirty beat him down, and it didn't set too well with that kid. They go back to camp, and they come back in the next day, and they wanted to kind of get even, so to say. So he had convinced some of the other cowboys they're going to ride their horses through the sheriff's office and kind of mess with him a little bit. The sheriff was laying for him, and the first cowboy that came through, he put a belly in his chest and pulled the trigger on him and killed him. And that cowboy happened to be the one that saved him there from George Ray when George Ray was going to kill him. So tensions were high there in Valentine, so to say. So they rode out of town, and they went back to where they were camped at, and they were telling all the other cowboys, "Let's strap up and go get them." And Addison Spa just happened to be riding in there, and he knew he needed to act fast. So he went to the wagon bosses. He said, "You guys need to get control of your boys right now. We're not going in there, and we're not going to tear down the town," because that was a pretty rough town at the time. So he grabbed one guy, and his most trusted guy was Frank DeCastro. He was a top hand. He said he had Frank come with him into town. He said, "There's still a couple guys in there. We need to get them out, and we need to get the heck out of here." So they ride into town, and there was an ex-employee of Spa's that was right in town, and he was full of liquor, and he had fallen in with a tough crowd of thieves and cattle rustlers. And he walked right up to Spa and declared that he was going to kill him. And he went to grab his gun, and Frank DeCastro saw it at the last minute, deflected the gun, and the shot went right over his shoulder, just shot a hole in his jacket. And when he deflected that gun, Frank DeCastro smashed him in the face and knocked him to the ground and knocked him out cold. And they said, "Well, we need to get our guys, we need to get out of here." So they gathered up their guys, and there was a general store that was kind of friendly to the OW cowboys. And they explained their situation, and that clerk handed them a scatter gun, which was a sawed-off shotgun, and gave it to them. And of course, they made it out of town without any problems. But they did have to bury a guy there, and it was that one that saved his life. Coincidentally, was the one that ended up getting buried that day. Basically, reading that about the Castro, I got a little intrigued by the guy, and he was a bad. My wife said not to cuss, so I'm not going to say it, but you get my gist. He was a cool dude. And I got pictures of Frank DeCastro, and I did a little bit of deep diving on Frank DeCastro. And so he homesteaded 5 miles northwest of here on Old Woman Creek, and he had worked his way all around this country. He worked for Kendrick. He was an open range guy. And he eventually... and he had the freight contract to run from Warren, Wyoming to Torrington, Wyoming, which is and that was in the early 1900s, and that's quite a swath. But in 1908, a massive flood swept away his buildings and caused significant damage to his property, and he ended up losing 100 pigs out of the deal, which I can't imagine people raising pigs in this country, but I mean, you can do whatever you want. After the flood wiped him out, they moved to town, and according to the obituary, the DeCastro's house was always a buzzing place around mealtime. They'd often have 12 to 15 people for supper, either neighborhood kids or friends over at a spur of the moment. He was noted for having the finest garden in the community. And I guess after that dust up in Valentine, even though he was an older man, there was a quote that I had heard a while ago, and the quote goes as, and I thought it was pretty fitting for Mr. DeCastro, but it's better to be a warrior in a garden than a gardener in a war. So come along, the famous roundup of 1884, it was one of the biggest of its kind. Nothing like this had ever been done. You know, the cattle were really new to the range, but they were bringing cattle in by the thousands down the Texas Trail. So Addison Spa was the man in charge of the roundup, the famous roundup of 1884. The participating companies, and feel free to come up here, I'll just say some of the notable ones, but in gist, it was, they rounded up, they worked 400,000 head of cattle with 200 cowboys and 2,000 head of horses. So they worked, I believe if the math is right, they worked out of 10 wagons, 20 cowboys to each wagon, and each cowboy had 10 horses in his string. Just quickly, Tom Bell out of Lance Creek, 15,000 head. Coffee Cattle Company, Hat Creek Basin, they had 10,000 head. Converse Cattle Company had 40,000 head. And the list goes on. It's there if you ever want to look at it. I find it pretty fascinating that few of cowboys, all with horses, not even firing up one combustible engine, they were able to work all those cattle, starting from west of Hot Springs and finishing all the way close to Independence Rock. It was said that at Spa, he would go from wagon to wagon checking on things, and he'd put on about 80 miles a day for, I think it took him 6 weeks to do it, and he was going through a lot of horses. The roundup leadership went as followed. Addison Spa was the foreman. His younger brother Curtis Spa was the assistant foreman, and then the foreman to him was Lee Moore, and the assistant foreman was J.B. Moore, which that Moore name's very prevalent around Converse County. The way that the roundup worked is they started at the head of Sage Creek, then they went to the OW Ranch, down to the Old Woman Creek, down to Lance Creek. And then they went from Harney Creek to 20 Mile to Walker Creek, Beaver Dams on Lightning Creek to Cow Creek, Snyder Creek to Lodgepole to Black Thunder, Cheyenne River to Antelope Creek, Dry Creek, Box Creek, and Lightning Creek headwaters, which they just generally would work drainages is how they'd separate what area of country they worked. And so this was, I think by then, Addison Spa was a man that he had a lot of foresight, and he knew this was the beginning of the end for the country. It was grossly overstocked. And when he was at the Cheyenne Club, a land broker said that there would be a foreign syndicate that would like to buy the Converse Cattle Company for $1 million, which $1 million in 1884 is the equivalent to $32 million now. And they didn't do it. And I think he knew that trouble was on the horizon, so he resigned as a foreman, and he had stake in the company, and by selling that stake in that company is how he was able to get his empire started. So when John Kendrick took over in 1886, that's when there was two really tough winters. So not only was the range depleted, you had hard winters to boot with that. And even though in those tough times, Kendrick was able to still turn a small profit for the company. But it was in 1889, Kendrick moved the entire OW outfit to Hanging Woman Creek in Sheridan, which was a pretty risky move. And my dad had told me from my great-grandfather, who helped move him up there, he said, yeah, this country's getting a little too overpopulated, so he went up to Sheridan, which seems backwards nowadays. So Kendrick got everything moved up there in 1889, and he bought the rest of the Commerce Cattle Company for the tune of $39,000 or so, because they ended up going bankrupt. Which is kind of funny to think that they started that company with $36,000 when they bought it from O.C. Wade, and then they eventually lost that company, had to sell out for about that much money. So there's a lot that goes with Kendrick. I'll just kind of hit the high notes. He was a very impressive man. He was similar to Spa. He was also an orphan that came from Texas, or he came up the Texas Trail as an orphan. He nearly died. He had a terrible stomach bug, but he was a man that was a student. And a lot of cowboys would go to town and they'd go to the places, and they'd blow their money on that. And Kendrick was spending all of his extra money on books, and he was a reader and he was a student. And he eventually was able to start putting holdings together, and he amassed 210,000 acres in Sheridan County through deeded and leases. And then he also had pretty big stake in the banks there in Sheridan, and he was very involved with the coal mining that went on in there. So Kendrick, his early political aspirations, believe it or not, the guy that was a future governor of Wyoming and a U.S. senator, in 1882 he lost the Lance Creek Constable election by 3. He only got 3 votes out of 22. Wasn't very popular around here. In 1890, he declined a seat in the Wyoming Territorial Legislature because he wanted to focus on ranching, banking, and stock growers' leadership. But when he started to ascend in politics, he was elected a state senator in 1910. Then 1914, he became an elected governor of Wyoming. And his progressive causes was game laws, workmen's compensation, utility commissions, and expanded women's rights. Elected senator in 1916, he chaired the Committee on Public Lands. He served on the Agriculture, Forestry, and Irrigation Committees, and he was a major advocate for irrigation, reclamation, land uses, and natural resources. Just to kind of touch on the high notes of Kendrick's legacy, he built the Kendrick Cattle Company to 210,000 acres. He helped expose the Teapot Dome scandal corruption, advanced worker compensation and water projects, which he was heavily involved with the Alcova Dam, the Pathfinder Dam, and the Seminole. Helped protect the Yellowstone and the Tetons, served 3 terms in the U.S. Senate from 1916 to 1933, and died in 1933, remembered as one of the Wyoming greatest leaders. That about does it for me. Thank you, JoAnn and Pat, for having us here today. I guess one thing is that kind of seems pretty cool to me is it just all around this Hat Creek break in this Niobrara County, it just feels like this is hallowed ground, and you can't go somewhere where there wasn't something historical from every corner of this county. It's a gem, and this is one of the cooler counties there is in Wyoming. So thank you, guys.